Summer, 1943. The heat clung to everything like a damp sheet that could not be shaken loose, even as the canvas-sided truck rattled along the dusty road toward the barbed wire compound. The three women sat shoulder to shoulder on the hard-wooden bench, their bodies swaying with each jolt. Sweat had matted their hair to their temples. The khaki remnants of their once crisp uniforms sagged with grime and salt. They said nothing, for words had become dangerous. Every syllable betrayed fear, and fear was forbidden. Emiko Takahashi, at 24, carried herself with the forced dignity of a nurse still on duty, though her fingers trembled against her lap. She had once prided herself on efficiency, on the steady rhythm of bandages tied and morphine measured, but here her tools were gone. She had only silence and a spine she willed not to bend. Beside her, 19-year-old Aiko Nakamura clutched the strap of a leather satchel that held nothing but scraps of paper and a broken pencil stub, relics of her brief conscription as a translator. She blinked too often, trying to hide her tears by pretending the dust made her eyes water. Keiko Sato, oldest among them, sat rigid as if carved from stone. 32 and already widowed, she had been a Red Cross volunteer who once scolded soldiers like naughty schoolboys. Now she pressed her hands together as if prayer might keep her from dissolving. The truck lurched to a halt. A metallic clang followed, the back gate swinging open to a blaze of sunlight. Rifles gleamed in the hands of American guards who stood not with the snarling cruelty the women had been taught to expect, but with an oddly casual firmness. One of the guards, tall and young with hair the color of straw, tipped his cap. His English words, clear and startling, sliced through the choking air. "Welcome, ladies." The three women froze. The term landed with the absurdity of a bird singing in a battlefield. Ladies. They had been braced for enemy, for Jap, for curses and spittle. Instead, this American boy with sunburned cheeks had flung courtesy at them like a grenade of politeness. Aiko's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Emiko's jaw locked, a protest forming but swallowed. Keiko gave the faintest of snorts, an almost laugh that curdled into bitterness. "Ladies," she whispered in Japanese, as if we were being escorted to tea. Yet her voice carried a tremor, for the insult of kindness cut deeper than cruelty might have. They were herded through the gates. The camp sprawled like an unlikely village, neat rows of low barracks, a watchtower standing like a stern schoolmaster at the edge, and beyond it the American flag snapping in the wind. The smell of boiled vegetables drifted faintly, and somewhere, astonishingly, music played, a radio bleeding swing tunes into the air. The women staggered at the sheer ordinariness. Was this war? Emiko remembered lectures where officers thundered that capture meant degradation worse than death. She expected to be spat upon, perhaps beaten, reduced to the status of livestock. But here a guard pointed them toward a basin of water and said, haltingly but politely, "You wash before chow." The word chow struck Aiko strangely, as if food were something to be joked about. They bent over the water. The liquid shimmered, cool and impossibly clean. Emiko splashed her face, tasting faint traces of chlorine, and for the first time in months the grit lifted from her skin. The relief was so sudden that tears stung her eyes, and she quickly turned away, pretending the water alone had reddened them. Aiko washed her hands compulsively, scrubbing as if to erase the memory of surrender. Keiko dipped her fingers slowly, reverently, then muttered, "Soap would be a miracle." Soap appeared, a small, rectangular bar, pale yellow, set down by the same straw-haired guard. He nodded stiffly, almost apologetic. The women stared at it as though it were contraband gold. Aiko reached for it, then recoiled. "Perhaps it is laced with something," she whispered. Emiko, weary of fear, seized it and rubbed it between her palms. Lather bloomed, rich and fragrant. She inhaled sharply. The smell was almost obscene in its familiarity, citrus and chemicals, a memory of laundries and clean sheets. Her stomach tightened, not from disgust, but from longing. That night, they were given food, bowls of stew, thick with carrots and potatoes, and bread still warm from baking. Keiko lifted her spoon with a hand that shook. She had sworn never to eat what the enemy offered. Yet the first sip melted into her tongue, and against her will tears welled. "I weep not for hunger," she murmured, "but because I can taste carrots again." Aiko held her bread uncertainly. She whispered, "In Tokyo, they told us Americans devoured their prisoners." She tore a piece, chewing cautiously. The taste of yeast stunned her. "If this is devouring," she said weakly, "then let them devour me." Emiko did not laugh. She only ate, methodically, as if each bite was an act of rebellion against despair. Later, in the dim barracks, the three women lay on bunks stuffed with straw, covered by coarse but clean blankets. Outside, the camp hummed with the ordinary noise of soldiers talking, boots crunching gravel, a harmonica drifting lazily. The women should have felt relief. Instead, confusion gnawed. "They are playing tricks," Keiko muttered. "This is another weapon." "Kindness is a weapon?" Aiko asked, her voice small. "Yes," Keiko said. "It breaks the spirit faster than hunger. They want us to believe surrender is not shameful." Emiko listened, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. She thought of the word ladies. Once, in her childhood, her father had called her that as she tried on her first silk dress. Now an enemy soldier had flung it at her like a gift she could not return. She clenched her fists. "We will not be softened," she said, but her own conviction faltered. Morning arrived with bugle calls. The sun poured over the camp, gilding the barbed wire until it resembled threads of spun gold. A group of American soldiers passed, tipping their caps at the women with exaggerated politeness. One said, "Good morning, ma'am." The syllables felt like mockery, yet there was no malice in his grin. Aiko whispered to Emiko, "Do they not know we are their enemies?" "They know," Emiko replied. "That is what makes it worse." Keiko, clutching her blanket like armor, muttered, "If they treat us as ladies, what are we now? Prisoners? Guests? Or ghosts?" The question lingered, heavier than the rifles that watched them. And as the women stepped out into the sunlight, the music from the radio swelled. American swing, jaunty and careless, a tune that had no business threading through the ruins of war. It clashed against the pounding of their hearts, against the memories of firebombed cities and the warnings of death before dishonor. It carried them forward, dizzy with dissonance. Emiko inhaled the mingled scents of soap, stew, and summer dust. Her spine stiffened with a stubborn pride, but her mind quivered with an unwelcome thought. Perhaps the enemy's most dangerous weapon was not the rifle, nor the barbed wire, but a single word casually spoken. She did not say it aloud. She only glanced at Aiko and Keiko, who looked equally unsettled, and they walked on in silence toward another day of captivity wrapped in courtesy. Yet beneath her ribs something restless stirred, a seed of dread and something else, something perilously close to curiosity. The guard at the gate saluted as they passed. "Ladies," he said again, his voice earnest, not mocking. The word echoed in Emiko's chest like a drumbeat she could not silence. She kept walking, eyes fixed on the far fence where the horizon shimmered. And she thought, with a chill that cut through the heat, if they call us ladies, then what will they call us tomorrow? The mornings inside the camp began with the metallic wail of a bugle, a sound that rolled across the barracks like a command disguised as music. The women stirred from their bunks, shaking straw from their hair, adjusting the coarse blankets that smelled faintly of bleach and dust. For Emiko Takahashi, every dawn was another trial of will. She rose swiftly, shoulders square, determined to face the day with the same discipline she had once demanded from her patients. To falter, she believed, was to hand victory to the enemy. Yet even she could not deny the strangeness that seeped into routine here. The enemy called her ma'am when handing out bread. The air carried scents she had long forgotten: soap, coffee, freshly cut grass. It unsettled her more than the crack of distant gunfire had months ago. Keiko Sato moved slower, her body still heavy with a widow's grief, yet her eyes traced every detail of their surroundings. She noted the watchtower shadow, stretching long and narrow like a sundial of captivity. She noticed how the barbed wire gleamed at dawn, deceptive as jewelry. She muttered prayers under her breath, though not to the Emperor anymore. Her prayers had shrunk into simple wishes: warm food, another day of breath. Aiko Nakamura remained the most visibly shaken. She lingered near the basin each morning, obsessively scrubbing her hands until her knuckles reddened. The soap fascinated and frightened her. She whispered to Emiko, "It smells like my mother's washing day." Then, quickly, as if ashamed, "It smells like home." Emiko scolded her, yet privately she understood. The fragrance clawed at memory with the same power as a photograph. That something so innocent should return here, between rifles and barbed wire, felt like mockery. When the guards called for roll, the women lined up with others. German soldiers captured in North Africa, Italian conscripts who shuffled with resignation, even a handful of Korean laborers pressed into service by Japan and now stranded in enemy hands. The Americans tallied them with efficient strokes of a pencil. What unsettled the women most was not cruelty, but indifference. To the guards, they were simply names on a list, not enemies worthy of venom. Emiko felt her pride bruise under that casualness. At meals, the contradictions deepened. Stew thick with vegetables was ladled into tin bowls. Bread still steamed when broken open. Aiko watched an American guard drizzle syrup over pancakes one morning and laughed without meaning to. "They eat sweets at war?" she whispered, incredulous. Keiko frowned. "Do not let them see your laughter. It weakens you." Yet even she could not hide the way her hands trembled when she tasted sugar after years of scarcity. One afternoon, Sergeant James O'Hara strode into the mess hall with his sleeves rolled high and a grin that seemed out of place among rifles. He caught Emiko's stare and raised a brow. "Don't worry, miss. That's just Spam on your plate. Even we don't know what it's made of." The Americans around him chuckled. The women did not laugh, but later Aiko confessed she nearly smiled. Humor in captivity was its own rebellion, though whose rebellion it was remained uncertain. Lieutenant Robert Miller, younger and more hesitant, oversaw their daily routines. He spoke Japanese poorly but tried, consulting a notebook where he scribbled words in phonetic clumps. To Aiko, who had studied English briefly before the war, his attempts were both absurd and disarming. Once he bowed clumsily and said, "Good morningo, miss." She corrected him, unable to resist. His ears flushed red, and for a fleeting second she saw him not as captor, but as an awkward boy far from his Iowa farm. That realization frightened her more than his rifle ever could. Keiko, however, distrusted every gesture. When Miller handed her a blanket, she muttered in Japanese, "Velvet on a sword." Emiko agreed outwardly, but at night she lay awake, recalling the sincerity in his eyes. Could kindness be sincere in a place fenced with wire? The thought gnawed at her discipline. Life inside the camp became a theater of contradictions. Radios crackled with swing music, Johnny tunes at odds with the solemnity of captivity. American soldiers tapped their boots to rhythms while mending fences or hauling supplies. The women listened from a distance, unsettled. Aiko confessed she liked the sound. Keiko hissed at her, "It is poison. They want you to hum along, and then you forget who you are." But Emiko knew the real danger was subtler. You remembered too much. Music awakened the woman she had been before uniforms and battlefields, a girl who once danced barefoot on tatami mats. Evenings offered strange reprieve. After roll call, the camp quieted. Stars stretched wide above the compound, indifferent to flags and borders. The women would sit outside their barracks, sharing whispers. Aiko asked questions that betrayed her youth. Do Americans also pray to ancestors? Do their mothers also scold them for slouching? Keiko silenced her, but Emiko answered quietly, perhaps. She had begun to see that the Americans, with their clumsy politeness and surplus of food, were not demons but men. That realization unsettled her more than hate ever had. Weeks passed. Routine dulled fear, yet suspicion remained. Keiko's mantra held them steady. Remember who you are. We are prisoners, not ladies. But the words began to sound brittle. as though spoken more for herself than the others. Aiko grew bolder, testing her English with Miller, asking for words she did not know. Once she requested the word for freedom. He paused, eyes clouding, then said softly, "Someday." The answer lingered in her ears long after. Conflict brewed quietly among the three. Emiko clung to pride, Keiko to suspicion, Aiko to curiosity. Each believed her way was survival. One night, as they lay in their bunks, Emiko snapped when Aiko hummed an American tune under her breath. "Do you want to shame us?" she hissed. Aiko retorted, "What is shame, if we are already defeated?" Keiko turned away, clutching her blanket. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Yet the camp itself pressed change upon them. Soap bars were replenished weekly, handed out like tokens of civility. Food never ceased. Guards tipped their caps, saying "ladies" with unwavering formality. It was as if the Americans insisted on rewriting the women's identity each day, until the word no longer sounded foreign but unavoidable. Emiko found herself answering to it, her head turning automatically when called. The realization struck like betrayal. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Miller approached with an announcement. His voice was steady, but there was tension beneath it. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will be transferred, closer to the Pacific Front." The words dropped like stones into the silence. The women stiffened. Transfer meant uncertainty, perhaps danger, perhaps liberation, perhaps worse. Keiko whispered, "So this was only prelude." Aiko clutched her satchel, trembling. Emiko stared at the horizon beyond the barbed wire, the sky bruised with streaks of purple. The camp around her seemed suddenly fragile, a bubble of courtesy about to burst. That night, none of them slept. The soap sat unused on the basin. The stew went half-eaten, and the music from the radio seemed distant, hollow. Emiko lay awake, replaying the guard's words. Closer to the front. Her mind clung stubbornly to the insult wrapped in courtesy, the single word she had tried to resist. Ladies. If they called them that tomorrow, would the bullets also be polite? The train that carried them rattled like a chain dragged across stone, each wheel's groan a reminder of distance, widening from the camp they had begun to understand. Dust seeped through the cracks in the wooden boxcar, mixing with the smell of sweat and stale bread. Emiko Takahashi sat rigid against the wall, her knees drawn up, trying to preserve some fragment of dignity in the cramped gloom. Beside her, Aiko Nakamura leaned toward the narrow slats of light, her lips moving as though she were silently rehearsing English words she had learned. Keiko Sato dozed, her face pale, one hand clutching her blanket like a talisman. The train stopped at dusk, the brakes shrieking. They were herded out by guards into another camp, this one nearer the Pacific. The barbed wire was the same, but the air was different, saltier, sharper, carrying the smell of the sea. The compound spread against a backdrop of palm trees, which seemed almost indecent in their beauty. Here, the war felt nearer. Planes droned overhead, and the ground sometimes trembled faintly with distant artillery. The women were assigned to a new barack, smaller, harsher, yet still marked by the same strange courtesy. They were given bowls of rice mixed with beans, unfamiliar rations compared to the stews of the previous camp. It was enough to still hunger, but not enough to still doubt. That night, lying on the thin mattress, Aiko whispered into the dark, "Do you think they mean it when they call us ladies?" Keiko grunted. "Words are bait. Don't mistake them for truth." Emiko remained silent. She replayed Lieutenant Miller's awkward bow in her memory, his soft correction when she mispronounced an English phrase, the way he had insisted on their dignity with an almost embarrassing earnestness. She wanted to dismiss it, but the memory lingered like a thorn. In the new camp, interactions with the Americans grew more direct. Guards stood closer, spoke more often, and sometimes lingered with questions that surprised the women. One evening, Miller himself visited, transferred along with them. He carried a clipboard but seemed less interested in inventory than in conversation. Spotting Emiko at the edge of the yard, he approached cautiously, as one might approach a wild bird. "You were nurse?" he asked in halting Japanese. Emiko's lips tightened. "A nurse for soldiers," she replied in clipped English, "not for enemies." His eyes softened. Out here, everyone bleeds the same. The words unsettled her more than threats would have. She turned away, but the sentence echoed within her like a low drumbeat. Everyone bleeds the same. Could such thinking be allowed? Aiko, emboldened by her growing English, engaged him further. "You from farm?" she asked, testing words. Miller smiled awkwardly. "Yes. Corn wheat. Iowa." He mimed shucking corn, and Aiko giggled despite herself. Keiko hissed at her afterward, furious. "Don't laugh with him. You disgrace us." But even Keiko could not erase the image of an Iowa field suddenly intruding upon her imagination. Green stalks swaying far from the Pacific. Daily life became a series of contradictions. American radios played jazz and swing, their rhythms alien yet strangely infectious. The women listened from their barracks, resisting the urge to tap their feet. Emiko once caught Aiko humming a tune and snapped. "Do you wish to forget who you are?" Aiko answered quietly. Perhaps remembering hurts more. Tension grew among them. Keiko hardened, convinced that kindness was a weapon sharper than steel. Emiko wavered, pride colliding with unbidden empathy. Aiko leaned into curiosity, eager for any word or gesture that suggested common humanity. Their unity, once their only shield, began to crack. One afternoon, Miller asked Emiko if she would help tend a wounded prisoner, an Italian conscript who had gashed his leg with barbed wire. Emiko refused at first, declaring she would not aid enemies. But when she saw the man's leg, torn and bleeding, her training overwhelmed her pride. She bound the wound with practiced hands, ignoring the tears of gratitude in the Italian's eyes. Later, alone, she sat trembling. She had saved the life of someone she had been taught to despise. That night she whispered into the dark, "What am I now?" Aiko pressed closer to her. "You are still you." But Emiko was not sure. The guards, too, seemed to sense the shifting currents. O'Hara, gruff and sardonic, joked one evening as he handed out rations. "Don't worry, ladies, it's only beans today. Our cooks are merciful." The word ladies still stung, yet its sting had dulled. Emiko realized, with alarm, that she now turned at the sound without hesitation. Clashes of ideology erupted in hushed tones. Keiko warned, "They soften us to erase us. If we accept their courtesy, we betray our emperor, our families, our dead." Aiko countered, "And if we refuse it, what do we gain? Hunger? Silence? We are alive. Why should we spit on that?" Emiko sat between them, torn, her silence speaking more loudly than words. Days bled into weeks. Letters sometimes arrived for German or Italian prisoners, their faces lighting with news from home. The Japanese women received none. They were cut adrift, belonging nowhere, neither to Japan, which had abandoned them in doctrine, nor to America, which held them with velvet chains. One evening, Miller lingered near the fence, sketching in his notebook. Aiko approached cautiously. "You draw?" she asked. He nodded, showing a rough pencil sketch of the compound, the barracks, even the watchtower. On a corner of the page, barely visible, were faces, hers, Emiko's, Keiko's. She gasped, half flattered, half furious. He quickly shut the notebook, embarrassed. "You are people," he said in broken Japanese. "Not ghosts." That night, Aiko whispered excitedly about the sketch. Keiko spat the word propaganda. Emiko said nothing, but in her heart she felt the tremor of recognition. Being seen, even by an enemy, was a kind of salvation. As the war dragged on, rumors seeped into the camp. Allied victories in the Pacific. Japanese ships sunk. Entire cities burned. The women listened, numb, their world collapsing from afar. Keiko prayed louder. Aiko asked more questions, and Emiko found herself drifting, caught between grief for her homeland and the unsettling dignity offered by her captors. One night, as the barracks lay in uneasy silence, a thunderous noise split the air, planes roaring low overhead, searchlights stabbing the sky. The ground quivered. Alarms blared. Prisoners scrambled. Guards shouted. Emiko clutched the edge of her bunk, heart pounding. The war had found them again, nearer and more merciless. When the chaos subsided, silence pressed down heavier than before. Outside, the sea crashed endlessly against the shore, indifferent. Inside, Aiko whispered into the dark, "If they call us ladies, will the bombs also be polite?" No one answered. The question hung in the air, sharper than barbed wire, a riddle none of them could solve. Winter descended with a kind of weary finality, as though even the seasons had grown tired of the war. The sea air turned sharp, carrying salt and smoke in equal measure, and the barracks creaked at night with the restless sigh of wood too long battered by storms. Rumors had swirled through the camp for weeks. Japan faltering, cities burning, a surrender whispered but never confirmed. The women lived in the space between hope and dread, caught in a pause that felt endless, until one evening the guard announced there would be a special meal. The words sounded almost obscene, a feast on the eve of defeat. Emiko Takahashi entered the mess hall with her back stiff, determined not to betray curiosity. Yet the smell betrayed her, rich, savory, foreign. Pork roast, its juices glistening under lamplight, lay carved in thick slices upon trays. Mashed potatoes mounded beside it, smooth and steaming, with gravy dark as earth. There was even pie, golden crust flaking beneath sugar. The women froze at the sight. Keiko Sato gripped her blanket tighter, as though food itself might strike her. Aiko Nakamura's eyes widened, lips parting in disbelief. They were guided to a long wooden table at the center of the room. 8 nurses, women like them, sat already waiting, their faces a mixture of awe and suspicion. Soldiers moved quietly between them, laying down plates, pouring coffee that smelled like warmth itself. The guard stood back, almost ceremonial, and one raised his glass in a gesture awkward yet earnest. "To the ladies," he said, the word once more. Always that word. Emiko felt her throat tighten. Once it had stung like insult. Now it landed differently, heavy with contradictions. She sat, her hands folding in her lap, staring at the pork roast placed before her. She remembered starving children in the hospitals back home, remembered scraping at rice so thin it scattered like dust. Here, in enemy custody, abundance mocked her memory. Keiko muttered, "This is their victory dance. They feed us to remind us we are beaten." Yet her hand trembled as she lifted her fork. She chewed slowly, her eyes filling despite her words. Aiko, bolder now, took a bite and laughed. A sharp, sudden laugh that startled even her. "I thought it would taste like ashes," she said softly. "But it tastes like life." The room warmed with chatter. O'Hara, the sergeant with the dry humor, strolled past and quipped, "Careful, don't tell the cook it's good. He'll never shut up about it." Some prisoners smiled despite themselves, the absurdity of laughter in captivity striking them like lightning. Miller, quieter, lingered at the edge, watching with a gaze that was not triumph, but something closer to sorrow. The women ate. Bite by bite, pride warred with need, hunger dissolving principles once thought unshakable. Emiko found herself loosening, savoring flavors she had not imagined she would taste again. She glanced at Miller, who caught her eye and looked quickly away. She wondered if he too felt the strangeness of this communion. Enemies breaking bread as though they were neighbors. Later, coffee was poured, its bitterness cut through the heaviness of meat and potatoes. Aiko cupped the mug in both hands, inhaling as though it were perfume. "I will never forget this," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. Keiko bristled. "Forget? That is what they want. Remember instead the emperor, the flag, the duty." But her own gaze lingered too long on her plate, and she swallowed the last bite of pie with something like longing. The guard stepped back, giving the women space, as though aware this was no longer a meal but a reckoning. Around that table, identities blurred. Nurses and guards, prisoners and captors, enemies and hosts. Emiko felt the ground shift beneath her, as though the world itself teetered on the edge of transformation. Conversation rose in halting fragments. A German prisoner told of harvest festivals back home, describing bread ovens the size of small houses. An Italian conscript sang a fragment of a folk tune, his voice cracking but warm. Iko, emboldened, asked Miller a question in English. "What happens tomorrow?" His face tightened, but he answered, "Tomorrow you go home." The word struck like thunder. Home! The women stared, stunned. For so long, the idea of release had been unimaginable, a dream too fragile to touch. Keiko clenched her hands. "Home," she repeated, but her tone was wary. Emiko's chest ached with a mixture of relief and fear. What home would she return to? A nation scorched by fire, perhaps ashamed of her survival. The meal ended slowly, reluctantly, as though no one wanted to rise from that fragile illusion. The guards collected plates, but the women lingered. Emiko noticed Iko slip the handle of her fork into her satchel, a keepsake of captivity. She did not scold her. She herself pressed the sliver of soap she had carried since her first day tighter into her pocket, now worn almost to nothing, yet still potent with meaning. Night fell heavy and quiet. From the barracks, the sea could be heard, its waves relentless, whispering of journeys. The women lay awake, their stomachs full, their minds restless. Emiko turned to Iko and Keiko. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we were never prisoners of their barbed wire. Perhaps we were prisoners of kindness, and that is harder to escape." Keiko closed her eyes, unwilling to answer. Iko whispered, "Then let us not escape it." Before dawn, the transfer began. The women walked in single file toward the ship that would take them away. The Americans saluted, caps raised, voices steady. "Safe travels, ladies." Again the word, bookending their captivity. Emiko paused at the gangway, looking back. Miller stood among the guards, his notebook tucked under his arm. Their eyes met briefly. No words passed, but the silence carried more than any speech. As the ship pulled from harbor, the women gathered at the rail. America faded into mist, the shoreline shrinking until it was only memory. The sea wind lashed their faces cold and briny, yet strangely clean. Iko leaned over, laughing at nothing, clutching her stolen fork like treasure. Keiko wrapped her blanket tighter, whispering to herself a prayer that faltered halfway. Emiko stood still, her hand slipping into her pocket. The soap was nearly gone, only a brittle sliver, yet she held it like a relic. It had been her first gift from the enemy, her first wound of kindness, her first hint that survival could taste of contradictions. She closed her fist around it, the waves rising high against the ship's hull, and thought of the word she had resisted for so long. "Ladies," it echoed within her, not insult, not victory, but something heavier, a bridge that could never be burned, even if nations willed it so. As dawn broke over the endless sea, she felt both freed and bound, knowing that one word, spoken by an enemy, would haunt her long after the war was ash and silence.